everybody. I would like to thank you for coming to the PSC Colloquium in the Thanksgiving week. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Duncan Watts. Duncan is the Stevens University Professor and Penn Integrates Knowledge University Professor with appointments in the Annenberg School, School of Engineering, and Wharton. He's also a recent associate of the Population Studies Center, and we hope that this presentation will be the beginning of many subsequent collaboration. We welcome him to the PSC. Duncan is a computational social scientist interested in social and organizational networks, collective dynamics of human systems, web-based experiments, and analysis of large-scale digital data, including the production, consumption, and absorption of news. His research on social networks and collective dynamics has appeared in a wide range of journals, including Nature, Science, American Journal of Sociology, and Harvard Business Review, just to name a few. He has received many awards, including the 2009 German Physical Society Young Scientist Award, the 2013 Lagrange CRT Foundation Prize for Complexity Science, and the 2014 Everett and Rogers Award. He was named an inaugural fellow of the Network Science Society in 2019 and a Carnegie Fellow in 2020. He's probably best known in sociology and population studies for his books 6 Degrees, The Science of a Connected Age, Small Worlds, The Dynamics of Networks Between Order and Randomness, and Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer. I love that title. That expand network theories closely connected to sociology. So please help me welcome Duncan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me today. It's great to be here. So I want to talk to you today about the topic of fake news. And if you haven't been living in a cave for the last 5 years or so, you will know that we are living through an epidemic of fake news. And you can see that this epidemic started very abruptly at the time of the 2016 election, where this term fake news really became popular to mean, and I'm going to use this definition rather specifically, deliberately false content masquerading as legitimate news, and even more so with the intent to mislead or inflame public opinion. So this is a topic that has attracted tremendous interest, both in the journalistic community, but also in the academic community, starting at the beginning, or since the beginning of 2017, over 5,000 research papers, academic papers, have been published just in English containing the phrase fake news in their titles. And just to put that number in context, fewer than 100 such papers had been published at any time leading up to the end of 2016. So this was really something that, essentially the term fake news didn't really exist before that, and when it was used, it meant more sort of satirical news. I think maybe you remember The Daily Show under Jon Stewart used to call itself the leading name in fake news. This is a very different meaning from that. And just to put it in some more context, in that same period of time, fewer than 600 papers have been published mentioning television news or TV news, and we'll see in a moment why that's a relevant comparison. So there is a huge amount of interest in this topic, and very specifically, the interest has circulated and been connected with questions about social media platforms. And so we not only believe that we're living in an epidemic of fake news, but that this epidemic has been created and sustained by our dependency on social media, particularly Facebook, but also Twitter and YouTube. And this belief is so widespread and so sort of entrenched in conventional wisdom that someone like Paul Romer, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, can write an op-ed in the New York Times and say a sentence like this: the dominant digital platform companies have created a haven for dangerous misinformation and hate speech that has undermined trust in democratic institutions. That is a hell of a causal claim there. but it's possible to say things like that and have nobody react, right? This because everybody believes it, right? So this is sort of, I think, a clear indication of the conventional wisdom. And what I want to talk about today is whether any of this is really true. Is there a question there? Yeah.
Yes. So on your graph, you're graphing the amount of fake news, and you gave a definition. And my question is, whose standards are used for this definition?
This is the standards of the 5,000.
Trump calls fake news.
Sure. Not. Okay. So what Donald Trump means by fake news is stuff he doesn't like, right?
Well,
what the academic research community means by fake news is deliberately engineered content masquerading as real news. That's what. So the 5,000. I think if you talk to the authors of these 5,000 English language papers, they would say that's what they mean by fake news. Okay, so that's the definition that I'm using here, and that will be important because there's lots of news that is not fake news by that definition, which is produced by mainstream, news producers that people will refer to fake. CNN is fake news, Fox is fake news. None of that is fake in this treatment of the expression, right? That's all real news. Maybe you don't like it. Maybe you think it's misleading. Maybe you've got a point. Maybe you're right, but it's not fake according to this definition. Okay?
yes.
I mean, that's the that's what we're counting. That's what we're going to count. Okay, so if it's not clear when we get to the end, we can talk about it. That is how we're going to define it, and that's what we're going to be counting very specifically. Is actually false information that is deliberately engineered to look like legitimate news. Okay, you can argue for a broader definition, and I will in fact argue for a broader definition later on. But that's what this research literature is about. Okay, so the question is, how much of that is there really, right? And in fact, there's a lot of it. And if you go and look online, you'll find it, and it'll look pretty terrible, right? And so if you study this this set here, fake news, you can easily find examples, and you can, Craig Silverman, who's a reporter for BuzzFeed, wrote this incredibly influential article at the end of 2016 where he went and found the 20 most engaged with fake news articles on Facebook, and he counted how many likes, comments, and user reactions they got, and found that that number exceeded the number for the 20 most engaged with legitimate news articles, right? So there was sort of the claim of the article was fake news is more popular on social media than real news, and that article itself was cited, hundreds, thousands of times, right? So that is the sort of work that you can do when you just go and look for examples of fake news. But the point I want to emphasize here, and I'll do it repeatedly, is that we want to put that number in some context, right? Every number that you read in a news article or really anywhere in a research article, you should always ask yourself, is this number big or small? And it's always big or small compared to something else. And so one baseline that we might compare fake news against is all news. So if we look at how much of the entire set of news articles that people are exposed to is accounted for by fake news, that gives us one baseline. Another baseline is to compare it to everything else that people are consuming, right? And as we'll see, people consume a lot of stuff that isn't news at all. The other way to slice this is to compare content that people are exposed to online, which is, again, overwhelmingly the focus of the research literature, with content that people are being exposed to in other media. And in particular, well, today we're going to talk about television. Ideally, we would also talk about radio and other kinds of media to which people are exposed. But because of the data that we have, we'll restrict that to television. but hopefully that will be enough to make the point. So what we want to do here is really question this dominant narrative that people are getting their news from social media and that fake news is highly prevalent in that information diet, and ask where in fact do people get their news, how much news do they get, and where are they getting it from. So the data that we're going to use comes mostly from Nielsen, the ratings company. We have two main data sets, panels that we get from Nielsen. The first one is their nationally representative TV panel. So this is really their sort of their crown jewels. This is the data that is used to price all television advertising during the period of time known as upfronts that come every year. So this is extremely valuable data that they spend a lot of time trying to ensure is in fact nationally representative. They also have a similar panel that is that covers online consumption, and I'll just emphasize that that is desktop-only consumption. They do more recently. We have gotten access to their mobile panel, but that happened after this paper was published. So clearly, desktop consumption is only one way that people get access to online content, and increasingly it is not, well, it's still pretty dominant. I'd say that online and mobile are both very important, but online in relative terms, mobile in relative terms is becoming increasingly important. And so to try to cover that, we have a third data set which came from ComScore, the other big ratings company. And ComScore has both mobile and desktop coverage, but it's collected in a different way, right? So whereas Nielsen is collected at the level of individual users, so we see every single URL that every person in this panel visits, so we have a very, very granular view of individual level consumption. ComScore is collected at the server level, at the website level, so that's why they can see both mobile and desktop, but they aggregate it up to the domain level. Okay, so we combine these two data sets at the domain level. So it's not perfect, but it does allow us to cover mobile, desktop, and news. We also a subsection of both of these panels, the desktop and the TV panel, are what is called the overlap panel. So about 25,000 users. We have both their TV and their online consumption. So that turns out to be very useful. Okay, so what are we going to count here? We are going to define news as any program that Nielsen calls news, effectively, right? And that includes pretty much anything that you're going to think of, all of the national cable shows, national networks, local TV, and we're even going to add in programs that are not specifically news, certainly not specifically hard news, but do sometimes contain some news. So morning shows are a great example here, where they're not exclusively or even mostly news, but they do contain some news, and they're extremely popular. So it's possible that for some people, for some Americans, the bulk of their exposure to what's happening in the world comes through these morning news programs, so we want to count those. We're also going to count late night shows like The Daily Show and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, because the perception is that young people in particular get their news coverage through these shows, which I think often do have pretty insightful commentary on the news, and so we want to count those as well. And basically, we're trying to be, to the extent that we can, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible about what we're defining as news, and you'll see why that's important in a minute. For online news consumption, we are going to do something similar. Online is way trickier than TV just because the web is a much bigger and less well-documented place. So there's many hundreds of thousands of websites of various sorts, and the distinction between news and not news gets pretty blurry. We're going to rely on previous research where our colleagues collected more than 800 websites that primarily cover hard news topics like politics, business, and international affairs. That's not going to be everything, but it is going to be a very large proportion of consumption. The distribution of consumption is very heavy-tailed, so the head of that distribution, a relatively small number of websites, accounts for a relatively large fraction of consumption, and then there's this sort of long tail of very small websites. So we can get something like 99% of consumption with this list of news sites. We're also going to, again, in the spirit of being as inclusive as possible, we're going to count some time spent on social media sites and search engines as news consumption as well, right? So it's possible that you search for something on Google and you get the top hit, and it'll often put it in a little box so you can get some information there. That may be all you need. In fact, that's exactly what Google wants to do, is just give you enough in the little box so that you don't have to even click on the article. So we want to factor in the possibility that you're getting some of your news consumption just from the search engine, and so it won't show up as a click to a news website, but it will still be news. Social media, I'll get to your question in 1 second. Social media sites like Facebook and Twitter, well, Facebook is particularly tricky because it's a walled garden. So we can't, when you're on Facebook, we just see that you're at facebook.com. We don't know what you're looking at. But if you click on something, if you click on a news article, it will spit you out into the open web, and we will see that you are on a website, a news website, and there will be a referral code in the URL that will say that you came from Facebook, right? And so we'll be able to, by looking at the percentage of links that you visit from Facebook, we can estimate how much news exposure you're getting on Facebook. Okay, so we're going to count that. So all of that percentage multiplied by the total time you spend on Facebook will also be counted towards news consumption. We do something similar for YouTube and Twitter. And then finally, anytime you spend on any of the three main portals, MSN, Yahoo, or AOL, we're going to count that as 100% news consumption, even though it's almost certainly less than that. Yes, question?
So just trying to better understand the Nielsen panel.
Yeah.
So you said these are individual panels, individual participants.
Yep.
Right. But then it's like if we have people living in the same household use basically one device. So not everyone has individual device. So are you really capturing individual level behavior, or you're capturing more the household level?
Yes, you have to log in. Each individual in the household has a separate login. So they separately track every individual in the household. The same is true for television, by the way, right? Now, obviously, if you're watching it together, that's, one of you will be logged in, but to the best they can, they are tracking individual level consumption within the household. That is correct, yeah. These are really expensive panels. I mean, they spend, I don't know how much they spend, but they have, hundreds of data scientists. I mean, it is a massive operation. Like, you don't want to try to do this at home, okay? And finally, for fake news, again, we're relying on previous research. We're doing that deliberately because we want to be counting the same things that other people have been counting. So by putting together a collection of papers by other researchers, this is Grinberg et al., a paper published in Science in 2017, as well as lists created by professional fact-checkers and journalists, people like Craig Silverman. We put together a list of 98 websites And some of them are completely fabricated, just totally some guy sitting in his living room, creating a fake newspaper with 100% fake stories in it. And others are, have a mixture of totally made up stuff and stories that are somewhat true or wholly true, potentially told from a very biased or hyper-partisan point of view. And so we have, like with the Grinberg group, we have a sort of black, red, and orange categories. So things can be in one of three categories depending on which sort of shade they are. The results I'll show you today include everything, right? So we're going to have the results for fake here will include any sort of outright fake, deceptive, low quality, or hyper-partisan content. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is I read about this, and there seems to be a lot of news or things going on something that gets labeled the dark web, and and I don't, to be honest, I don't really know what they're talking about. And is it like, do you capture that? And is this last thing capture some of that? There seems to be like web pages that get created, especially like I don't really know what they. Do you have any information about that? This is something that.
So potentially there's stuff like 4chan or 8chan where there's conspiracy theories circulate. We do not have that, right? If it's individual people talking to each other, right? We don't count that as news, right? So there's lots of things that people say in the world that are fake or wrong or misleading. People say that in their own interpersonal conversations and on social media sites and on Twitter. And we are not counting any of that, right? So this is not a count of like all the misinformation in the world, right? It is just a count of fake news. And again, this is what other people have been counting, right? So not to say that we shouldn't worry about that, but we're going to put that on the side for the moment, yes.
So the way that you're operationalizing it here, are you saying that everything on these 98 websites is fake and everything on all the others is not fake?
Correct.
Because you could potentially have some fake news that appears on YouTube or some other source.
If you visit one of these 98 websites on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, we'll count it as fake news exposure, right? So if you go to like Daily Caller, right, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or on their website or on YouTube, we're going to count that as consumption of fake news, okay?
If you click there through YouTube, but what if there's a video posted on YouTube that somebody has...
Well, YouTube, we can see what you're looking at on YouTube. So so YouTube, everything is like a bit of a special case because the web is complicated. On Facebook, like I explained, we cannot see what you're clicking on. On YouTube, we can, right? The YouTube is like an open system. So if you click on a video on YouTube, it will be there right in the URL and Nielsen will have it. So we can go crawl we can go visit YouTube's API and we can download the metadata for every video that anybody consumes on YouTube, okay? So YouTube is relatively transparent. Facebook is not, okay? That's why I've specifically talked about Facebook. But we do classify these 10,000 videos on YouTube as about news and politics, right? So we're doing our very best to count as much fake news as we can. And I assume that we missed some, and so you can mentally feel free to double every estimate that I give you, okay? Or triple it if you want. It won't change anything. Okay, so we are actually trying to overestimate consumption of fake news and also real news. We're trying to overestimate both of them, right? Or we're stacking the deck as much as we can towards being inclusive in these definitions. And in the paper, or actually in the online supplementary materials to the paper, we do all the calculations with narrower definitions, where we only include, for example, hard news. We exclude sort of, entertainment news and all the sort of sports news. And we also do the same where we exclude hyper-partisan content because it's not exactly fake, right? It's not totally made up. It does include some things that are true, and it will just make these numbers smaller, okay? So here's the main result, and I'll show you several other slides where we sort of break it up in different ways, but essentially the main sort of three findings of the paper are all right here in this figure. And just to walk you through it, so the blue colors, the blue bands, refer to, so first of all, this is total media consumption per person per day over the period January 2016 through the end of 2018, okay? So 3 years worth of media consumption. And you can see that there is an awful lot of it, right? That people are consuming about 480 minutes a day of media content on television, on their mobile devices, on desktops. So it's not that we're not seeing stuff. So several hours a day that people are spending getting information of one sort or another. The blue bars is content that is not related to news. Okay, so this is people watching videos, music videos, how-to videos, searching, going on Facebook or Twitter and doing things that are not related to news, watching movies, streaming, everything that you do, right? Several hours a day of it, and the vast majority, about 86% of that time, is not devoted to consuming news at all, right, of any sort, on any medium. The green bars are content that refers to news, so that's about 14% of content that people are consuming every day is related in some way or another to news. And the dark green refers to television, right? The lighter green refer to mobile and desktop. And you can see that when it comes to news, so this is sort of the second main point, when it comes to news, television completely dominates online as a source of news, right? So overall, it's about 5 to 1 over the entire population. I'll show you the results for different demographic groups in a minute, but it doesn't really change. So if you wanted to study news consumption and you had to choose between television and online, it would be an easy choice. You should choose television, right? But actually, that is precisely the opposite of the research community, which vastly focuses on online consumption. And then finally, the fake news is in there. It's this tiny little thin bar along the top here. That is the sum of all time spent on any of these fake news sites. Okay, so that's about 1% of total news consumption and 1/10 of 1% of total media consumption. And that number actually is sort of quite consistent with other estimates that have looked at individual websites like Twitter, for example. Yes, 2 questions.
Just a quick question. It looks like there's some seasonality, like is it nadir in July? Is that something that turns out in media studies?
Things go up and down. If you look over, you can tell a story about summer and people being sort of less engaged with the news. My experience with this data is that every time I'm tempted to tell a story like that, we then get another year's worth of data and the story does not hold up. But you might be right there, right? That there is, you can see a couple of, so this is the election, right? and this is the inauguration, okay? So there are some spikes. I don't recall what this spike is here, but sometimes you do see spikes corresponding to individual events. I don't have the update of this data right now, but we have done it up to 2021, and you see a big spike at the 2020 election. You see a big spike at the beginning of COVID. So sometimes you can pick out individual events, and you can see that people are increasingly sort of tuning in to the media, to the mass media for those events. And then other stuff, I don't know, you know. But it's television, the dominance of television is consistent, right? And if you're wondering about different age groups, they're different, right? 55 and over consume a lot more content in general, a lot more media in general than younger people. They consume a lot more news than younger people, as you might imagine. They spend less time on mobile devices than younger people, which is what you would imagine. And they're way more focused on television. So the TV to online news consumption for 55 and over is about 8-to-1. And for 18 to 24, it's about 2-to-1. But that might surprise you, because you might think younger people are getting all their news on their mobile devices. But it turns out they're not. They're still getting twice as much news from television as from the web. Okay, so it's not 8-to-1, and it's not even 5-to-1, but it's still 2-to-1, right? So the ordering of results that I showed you on the previous slide holds for all demographic groups. That the vast majority of media consumption is not news. The vast majority of news is television news, and fake news is basically a non-entity, right? Now, that doesn't mean it's a non-entity for everyone, right? So if we were going to, we could have a separate conversation, and I think this is probably true, that to the extent that fake news and conspiracy theories and other kinds of worrying content are problematic on social media sites, it is because they are being heavily consumed by a very small number of people who are mostly looking for it, right? They are there because they want it, they're actively seeking it out, and they're consuming it voraciously. And absolutely we should worry about those people, right? But that is just a different problem than the entire population is being bathed in this sea of misinformation. So that's the question we're addressing here. Absolutely, we can talk about the other question. And so depending on the problem that you're, you know, if you're worried about, you know, why did a few thousand people show up to the Capitol on January 6th, believing that the election had been stolen, like that's absolutely a question we should be worried about. But that number is a very small number by the standards of an election, for example. So if you're worried about, you know, general public opinion and, you know, sort of effects that swing the votes of millions of people, I don't think that it is in this little red line here, but other things may be in it, right? So I don't want to say that you know, even a tiny fraction of overall consumption is still a lot of people, right? And still a lot of time for some of those people. But on average, it is not a major or a significant part of daily media consumption. Yes, question. Oh, sorry, behind you.
I know that you said that it's a big production, and I just historically always thought of Nielsen as a TV ratings company. Is there any type of selection in the sample about like the people who would participate in this type of study would be those that watch more TV?
I mean, anything is possible. They certainly go to a lot of trouble. You know, we're not, you know, privy to all the details of how they recruit and manage their panel. I will say I have received a recruiting letter from Nielsen asking me to join their TV panel. One of my co-authors also got one. So they really send these things out, and they spend a lot of, they have weights assigned to individual people in the panel that are the sort of the inverse frequency of your, so every person in the panel is given a weight such that the numbers multiplied by the weights are representative of the television viewing population. You can pretty quickly get into some sort of fairly almost philosophical questions about like what it is that you're trying to estimate. So for example, in the overlap panel, you can weight them by the number of people in America who own a TV and have an internet connection, or you can weight them by the number of people who actively use both. And they turn out that's not the same number, and so which one do you want to use, right? So I think you have to make some choices about like, you know, who it is that you're trying to measure, and we sort of, you know, we argue about these things and we do the best we can. To the best of our knowledge, these are representative members of the population, right? Now, I would say that we in this room are not representative members of the population, and some of what people find surprising about these results when I talk to them is they think, I don't watch television. I read the New York Times, you know? I read it from cover to cover. And before I had young children, I used to do that too. And I would actually like walk around with my physical, I still get it delivered and it just sits on the coffee table all day long now. But I, you know, I would read the physical newspaper, and I can tell you that is not what most Americans are doing, right? So I think people in the academic research community were very much online and we're very news oriented. So if you did this plot for us, it would look super different, right? And I think that's part of what's going on here, is that there is a tendency as a researcher to sort of naively generalize from yourself. And when you look at the representative data, it looks wildly different, okay?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that. I was wondering about that. Can you tell us a sorting of people where people, you know, like this is what you see, the distribution, you know, the cross-sectional distribution, but can you tell whether people consume mainly entertainment, and then you have, you know, like what, you know, 80% of consumption is entertainment?
Let me show you that.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
We'll get to that. Sorry, thank you for all these questions, but I do have a few more slides that maybe will answer some of them. Okay, so this is what we find comparing different types of different categories of consumption. So on the left, we have online. On the right, we have television. And you can see, you know, some things look like what you would expect, right? So social media is by far the most dominant type of consumption online. And some of that is news. So this is the chunk of social media that we're accounting as news consumption. Here's news down here. Actual sort of people going to news websites is really a very small portion of what they're doing. Portals, this is AOL, MSN, and Yahoo. And again, we're counting 100% of the time that people spend on portals as news consumption, even though it's probably not. And then you can see there's a bunch of other stuff that they're doing, you know, totally reasonable things like, you know, watching videos, searching for stuff, you know, going on Amazon, you know, engaging in, you know, e-commerce. Gaming is a big thing. Also retail is there. So, you know, there's lots of things that people do online that make sense when you look at them. And news is a relatively small fraction of all of that, okay? On television, news is a much bigger deal. It is the single biggest category of consumption on television, right? It's not a majority, right? If you add all the other bars up, it's still only a relatively small portion of television consumption in total, but it is the single biggest category. And we'll dig into this more in a bit, but you can see local news is a pretty big chunk of news, right? And this is, I mean, I think local news is, you know, really the dark matter of the misinformation world. Nobody studies local news. It's so hard to get access to. So there's hundreds and hundreds of these. There's 230 DMAs, these marketing areas, digital marketing areas across the country, and every one of them has its own mixture of local news programs. It's very hard to aggregate this sort of data, although we are currently working with a different data provider right now to ingest a really almost 40 terabytes of data that will cover all of national and local news content. So we should be able to answer that question sometime in the near future. But so yes, news is a big fraction of TV, and this little bar down here on top of variety, this is the late night shows, right? So you can see that's actually not a big player in the news ecosystem, and it turns out that's true even for younger people. That where people get their news is really the mainstream stuff. The next, just sort of to drive in this point about TV dominance of news, this data is just desktop consumption. So we'll talk about that in a second. But this is for the 25,000 people on the overlap panel. So this is at the individual level, people for whom we observe both their television and online news consumption and their desktop news consumption, how much of each are they consuming? And this is really striking. So 44% of this panel don't consume any online news in a given day, right? So, and then 3/4 consume less than 30 seconds, right? So to the best of our ability, desktop and mobile have about the same weight in consumption, right? So if you double it and you say, well, let's assume that we're not observing half of the news consumption, then you can still arrive at the following claim, that 3/4 of Americans consume less than a minute of news online every day, right? So this is a very, very small, low exposure to news. And again, is nothing like my consumption, where I'm sort of on Twitter a lot during the day, and I'm constantly clicking on news articles. That is not typical. Meanwhile, most people do watch a fair amount of news on television. Okay, so this is sort of 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day, and they're not substitutes, right? So the more news you consume, the more news you consume everywhere, right? Okay, and then finally, breaking down news consumption, right? So this is now, if you sort of throw out the 86% of stuff that is not news and just focus on the part that is, what type of news are people consuming and where are they getting it from? Again, the mainstream stuff dominates everything, right? So this is sort of a very different picture or very different narrative than what the mainstream news organizations themselves are telling you, right? Because they're if you read the New York Times or the Guardian or the Washington Post, they talk so much about how everybody is getting their news on social media. They don't mention that what they're getting on social media is in fact their content, right? So the vast majority of content across all age groups is mainstream news sites, right? And maybe it's you going directly to them, maybe it's you getting them from social media, maybe it's you getting them from search, but one way or another, it's the big brand name sites that you're ending up on, right? They completely dominate consumption, right? And once again, the red bars of fake news are bigger because we're only looking at online content here. But even just within online news, it's still a relatively small category. It is bigger. This bar is bigger for older people, and that again is consistent with previous research where they have found that older people tend to be more heavy consumers of fake news. So that is something that we find, but it's if you were just sort of measuring the fractional increase in the size of these red bars, you would probably get a statistically significant effect because the numbers are so big, and then you could write a paper about how older people consume more fake news, but you would still be missing the fact that this small red bar is sitting on top of this much, much larger. Yes?
Just remind us where Fox News is located.
Where's Fox?
Yeah.
Oh, Fox is over here. So Fox is a national cable news, so it's the light green. So there's a lot of Fox in here, 55 and up, right?
That would not be counted as.
We do not count that as fake news. That is correct. Even though, but totally open to suggestions. And believe me, I have my problems with the New York Times and all of them in terms of cleverly misrepresenting things without actually saying something that's fake. And hopefully I'll have some time to talk about that because I'm going to run out. Okay, so yeah, again, national, local news, national network news is here, cable news. These are all big components of what people are consuming. Okay, so just to quickly recap, news is a small part of overall media consumption, only about 14%. TV news dominates online news 5-1. I didn't show you the echo chambers result, but it turns out that if you care about people consuming news from a particular partisan leaning, that is also a bigger effect on television than it is online. And fake news is really barely present for an average person, okay? So what's going on, right? If this is true, then, why are we so worried about all of these problems that we're talking about in society today? Sort of undermining democracy, people failing to agree on basic facts. Our claim is that, I think some of you have sort of alluded to this already, that there is a lot of other media and news out there that is part of the mainstream establishment that probably should be included under the broader envelope of misinformation. That fake news, in my view, is way too narrow a category to be explaining much of what is going on, okay? So, this is sort of an obvious point, or all of these points are obvious, but I wrote a whole book about everything is obvious once you know the answer, and really what that means is that it's not obvious. So there's lots of supposedly obvious things that are not obvious to people. And one of them is that it's really sort of trivially easy to mislead people without lying. I don't even know why people bother lying, actually, because it's so easy to mislead them without saying anything that's actually false that you might as well just do that, right? It's sort of almost just lazy to lie. So one way you can mislead people is when you give them a number, you only give them the numerator and you leave out the denominator. And the reporting on fake news is filled with that kind of misleadingness, right? These are all numbers that were taken from mainstream media articles that were sort of making outrageous or claims about the outrageous nature of what was happening. And this first one, it was repeated so many times that I just couldn't believe it, right? Russians purchased 3,000 ads on Facebook during the election at a cost of $100,000. And this number was repeated over and over, sort of breathlessly, as if this were like a big, scary number. And with sort of 5 seconds of research, you can look up Facebook's ad revenue, and it's about $96 million every single day. So this is a tiny number, right? This is a barely registering number, right? The idea that that number somehow changed the course of an election is theoretically possible, but sort of an incredibly long bow to draw. Same for every other statistic that we were able to find that was sort of being repeated not everything we were able to find, but just that a casual search turned up, right? You can find, once you include the denominator, it totally changes the story. And this is, Craig Silverman's article that was referred to over and over again. It's a very strange way of counting because there are so many more non-fake news articles on Facebook than fake ones, that to compare the top 20 of each category makes no sense, right? So, so you can easily mislead people with numbers. You can also mislead people with editorial emphasis. This is one of my favorite tricks that the New York Times played during the presidential election of 2016, where we coded every front page article that they published in the 3 months leading up to the election as about policy issues, about horse race issues, and about personal scandals. And in the last 8 days of the election, between when James Comey announced that he was reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email and the election, the New York Times ran as many front page articles about that email scandal as they ran about any policy issues during the entire 3-month period, right? So there was an overwhelming emphasis on this one very, very specific issue, which I think we can all agree now does not seem like such a big deal, right? But the New York Times made it a very big deal, and this was the New York Times, right? So this is supposedly a liberal newspaper, right? That should probably be leaning towards the Democratic candidate. And if they're writing an overwhelming amount of critical coverage, you can imagine what the rest of the media is saying. And so before we go and blame Cambridge Analytica for tipping the election, maybe we should wonder about the effect that the New York Times had on the election, right? Another way that the mainstream media can mislead is simply by amplifying falsehoods that come from elsewhere. And there's a lot of this, right? So, every time Trump said something on Twitter, it would be reported by the mainstream media because they would say, well, we have to report it. This is news. This is the president. But of course, that's not true. They have all kinds of choices. They make choices all the time about what to cover and what not to cover. They do not report everything that every president says. They simply reported everything that that particular president had to say. And that's how most people find out about it, right? So, most people, if you learned about Hillary Clinton running a sex ring in a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., you probably heard about it from the mainstream media, not from, your own, doing your own research on 4chan, right? So there is an awful lot of repetition of falsehoods, often in the headlines of articles, right? And maybe sort of in paragraph 8, the journalist will say there's no evidence to support this claim, but the number of people who read the headline vastly outweighs the number of people who read paragraph 8. So there's a lot of amplification happening. Cherry picking is another one of my favorite sins, and this, I'm sure academics do this too, but journalists are particularly good at it. This was an article that caught my attention in the Washington Post about some survey about how there was a sort of emerging age of sexlessness among young men. Look at this dramatic trend, and then Simon DeDeo, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon, went and reanalyzed exactly the same data and simply looked over a longer time period. And you can sort of tell by sort of selecting the time interval and running your regression through it, you can find any result that you want. But the best result is that there is no trend at all, right? So basically, nothing is happening. There is no story here, and yet here we have the Washington Post writing this dramatic article about it. So climate science skeptics do this sort of thing all the time, where they're like, oh, there's nothing happening, so we sort of carefully select a period of time when we see no trend, and then if you look over the broader picture, you see that, in fact, there is a trend. You can do the opposite as well. You can create a trend where none exists. This is a good one. This is research, an article about a research article written by Gordon Pennycock and Dave Rand, and the article actually states the result correctly, which is that people who scored higher on this cognitive reflection test, CRT, were less likely to believe fake news articles. The headline writer somehow got totally the wrong idea and flipped the result in the headline. And so Gordon Pennycock is complaining on Twitter about this, right? So headline writers have their own agendas and generally not the people who write the articles. And certainly in my own experience of having other people write my headlines, which hasn't happened very much, but has sometimes been traumatic when it has happened, they're not necessarily reflective of the content. And then finally, this is a very sort of Annenberg perspective that, for many years now, media researchers have worried that the main effect of the media is not that it tells you what to think, right? But that it tells you what to be thinking about, right? That they set the agenda, they determine the conversation, they decide what is being discussed. And that is a tremendously powerful influence, partly because it's so invisible, right? By the time you're talking about something, you're not asking yourself, why are we talking about this and not some other thing, right? So, why are we all talking about Hillary Clinton's emails? Well, that was the news, right? How could we not be talking about it, right? But that was a choice. That was an editorial choice. That was a journalistic choice. There are plenty of stories of that magnitude that did not become major news stories. The mainstream media worries about this effect in the context of Rupert Murdoch because they don't like him, and I don't like him either. And I would very much worry about what his personal agenda is, and I think that's a totally legitimate concern. But the same thing applies to all of them, right? And I'm not saying that there's a conspiracy here. I think that most people who work for these news organizations are well-intentioned people and have a view of themselves as honorable, honest actors. But they're not outside observers, right? They act as if they are simply reporting on things that are happening and they have no choice about it. They are actively shaping events. So what are we going to do here at Penn? Just a quick ad to finish up. We have a project here called Penn Map in my lab where we are basically trying to collect as much data as we can to answer questions about the production, consumption, and absorption of information across the information ecosystem. What I have showed you today is the consumption part of things. We also are doing a lot of work to measure production, basically everything that is being said. This involves a sort of a combination of a lot of data mining and data cleaning and natural language processing and machine learning, but applied to very sort of communications, social science type questions. This is like a little dashboard showing some of the same data from what I showed you today. But I hope this is sort of the beginning of a longer conversation because I think this, Amelia and I had a nice chat about this a few months ago. We are very interested in partnering with other researchers at Penn who are interested in this sort of data, right? So if there is, if there are topics that you're working on where you think, oh, it would be nice to sort of see everything that got broadcast on television in the last decade about this topic, in theory, at least, we have that data, right? We have the closed caption text for all television programs. And by the way, all ads, which was sort of a nuisance thing where my postdoc sort of realized that all of her natural language, her topic models were being thrown off by the insertion of ads into the middle of the programs. So she cleverly found a way to extract all of the ads. So now we have a data set of all ads that were shown in the last 10 years. So, if you're interested in opioid epidemics and, which regions of the country saw the most ads about which drugs, like in theory, we have all of that data. The work that I talked about today and a lot of the work that we're doing in this project is very descriptive, right? We don't have fancy models. We don't have causal claims. We don't know really what's causing what. We're skeptical about some of the causal claims that are out there right now, but mostly on the grounds that we don't think anybody knows what's going on, right? And so we think if we're going to solve the problem, we have to first figure out, before we decide on what the solution is, we have to first figure out what the problem is. And in order to figure out what the problem is, we have to be measuring reality much better than we are currently doing it. So that's really the goal of PennMap, and I'd be happy to talk about that further. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. Comments, questions? I want to follow up on this, the things that could be done, and things like that. You know, with the COVID pandemic,
Yep.
epidemic, and fake news. I mean, they seem to be connected, like the rumors about vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that could be captured in this data set?
Well, again, what we have is, if anything was, broadcast on television or, on the web, then we would have that data, right? If it's, people talking in a Facebook group, right, we would not have that data, right? Now, we may at some point be able to get that data from Facebook. If it's a public group, I think we now have a researcher API that we can access. So depending on whether groups are public or private, there's different availability. So actually, I think possibly for public Facebook groups, we could go find that sort of. That gets very tricky though, right? Like once you get into like natural language, particularly people talking to each other, it can become very difficult to figure out what they're, in an automated way to figure out what they're saying. But yeah, we would be very interested in that sort of thing. Yeah, and the emergence of conspiracy theories. So I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to say that stuff is not important, but I think that the reason why we're focused so much on the mainstream media here is that the mainstream media is telling a narrative about what happened in the last 5 years, and it is, recently it's turned into a drumbeat of accusations, mostly against Facebook. And not to say that Facebook doesn't do, doesn't have some undesirable effects. I think for any platform with 3 billion people, you're going to find bad stuff if you go look for it, right? But I'm not persuaded that it has the sort of societal effects that are being claimed, right? And so I think we just have to look more broadly, and if looking more broadly, we find that for certain types of questions, YouTube is a huge problem, that's fine, right? But I think if we just decide, ex ante, that we're only going to look at a particular platform because we just sort of know for whatever reason that that's where the problem is, then we're going to sort of fall for this problem of looking under the streetlight rather than looking where the keys are. So that's the main message.